Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to Marcus East for this keynote address, Leapfrogging Through Digital Transformation, an Insider's Guide. Let me briefly introduce Marcus before giving him the floor. Marcus spent the first half of his career working for leading technology companies and the second half helping brands like Google and National Geographic harness technology to drive business value. Today, he is Senior Vice President and Chief Digital Officer at T-Mobile USA. Prior to this, Marcus was the Technical Director in the Office of Google's Chief Technology Officer, Executive Vice President of Product and Technology and CTO of National Geographic, and held leadership roles in digital technology for Marks & Spencer, Apple, and Comic Relief. He is an expert in residence at the Oxford Foundry, which equips young entrepreneurs to design ethical ventures that put people and the planet first, and was responsible for Nat Geo's widely acclaimed digital transformation. Marcus, I'll be back to ask you some questions shortly, but the digital floor is yours.
Thank you, John, and thank you for that warm introduction. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you. Thanks to The Economist Impact for inviting me to participate. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about. It really is, how do organizations really use digital transformation to leapfrog the competition, but also to find ways to better serve their customers? So let's dive in. By way of introduction, obviously you heard from John a little bit about my background, but another way to think of it is that quite uniquely, I've spent half of my career working for the companies that are disrupting the world. So IBM, where I started my career nearly 30 years ago, Apple and Google, these companies have created the technologies that have really shaped the world as we know it today, whether it be the iPhone or whether it be the way in which we access information via Google. But the other half of my career has been in brands that are at the other side of that equation. They're brands that have been impacted by technological advance and by digital transformation. And it's worth noting that both Marks and Spencer and National Geographic are over 130 years old, and their experiences of digital transformation have been quite different. And one of the things that I'd like to do in this presentation is really share with you what my experience in nearly 30 years of working in this space has taught me, but also what some of the research that I did recently for a book has helped me to understand in terms of what are the characteristics of those organizations that are most successful when it comes to digital transformation. So as I said, it's a topic I'm passionate about. I could talk for hours on this topic, but as we only have 20 minutes, let's dive in. So I'll start by just reaffirming the need for transformation. I think that many of you will have heard about digital transformation for a long time, but I have a slightly different spin on why I think it's important. We're then going to talk about how you can actually power your digital transformation. And in my mind, it's important that whilst there's lots of analyses around this is what's happening and this is how it's changing industries, there isn't as much helpful practical advice as to what you need to do. And the research that I'm going to share with you came from me interviewing and surveying over 2,500 business executives. And I think it is something that you will find useful and compelling. I'll then move on to talk about some success stories where we will look at some companies that might surprise you, companies that have been successful in embracing digital transformation. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So let's dive in. This is one of my favorite comments. Back in 2007, Steve Ballmer, many of you will know as the president and eventually CEO of Microsoft, said something quite profound. On hearing about the Apple's plans for the iPhone, he said there is no chance that the iPhone will get any market share. No chance. In fact, he was so passionate about this that he said it at many places and suggested that it was time to sell your Apple stock and perhaps to close the company down. Now, that's pretty interesting because he was at the time the leader of, or one of the leaders in one of the world's biggest technology companies. He'd helped to shape the previous wave of generation. But unfortunately for him and for Microsoft, he was absolutely wrong. In fact, it took Apple less than a decade to sell 1 billion iOS devices. So this idea that Apple was never going to get any market share for a product that was a web browser, an MP3 player, and a phone was clearly incorrect. And there is a lesson there for us because with access to all of the data that he had and with his insights as a technologist, even he wasn't able to accurately predict that future. And that is one of the challenges that's facing us today. And that really talks to why we need to think about digital transformation. This picture reminds us that not only was the iPhone successful, but Apple became the most valuable company in the world. And the way in which humans interact with technology changed forever. In fact, I was reading an interesting report recently that suggests that for many people, their smartphone is the first thing that they touch in the morning when they wake up and the last thing that they touch at night before they go to bed. And I think that was very hard to predict. And the question for all of you listening is, what does the next decade look like, and what can you do to position yourselves for success? And the reason it's important really came out of some great research that was shared at Davos back in 2016. Pierre Nanterre, who was at the time the president and CEO of Accenture, shared a really startling fact. He presented some data that suggested that between 2000 and 2016, 51% of Fortune 500 companies had ceased to exist. They didn't slip out of the Fortune 500, they had ceased to exist. And when Accenture looked at in detail what were the reasons for these failures, they discovered one consistent theme. It was the inability of these organizations to embrace digital transformation. And quite often they were sideswiped by new entrants coming into their markets and really disrupting their business to the point that they were no longer viable. So this is why we still need to think about digital transformation. To me, as someone that's been working in this space for nearly 30 years, it's surprising in a way that we still need to talk about it. But I will tell you that I believe the need has never been greater. And one of the reasons for that is that if we think the last decade was disruptive, I have to tell you that the next decade, this decade that we're in now, is really seeing an acceleration of the changes driven by technological advances. And so between 2020 and 2030, my expectation is that we will see more disruption, more change, and an even greater impact on the composition of indexes like the Fortune 500. So this might surprise you. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you shouldn't do before we dive into what you should do. Many of you will recognize this. It is one of the iconic entrances to an Apple store. And many of you will be thinking that digital transformation and innovation requires you to be like Apple. And the reality is you probably, and your organization probably can't be like Apple. And whilst they might be a really interesting, inspirational, aspirational brand for you, that is not the mission. Similarly, many people, particularly CEOs, will say to me, Marcus, how do I be like Google? We want to be the next Google. We want to be a tech company. And once again, perhaps controversially, it's my belief that that is not what you need to do as leaders in your organizations. What you need to do is not to emulate those companies, but to really understand what it is in those companies that has allowed them to be successful. And that really, for me, is where this next part of the presentation, I think, is really the meat of this topic, in that I want to talk about what organizations need to do to really power their digital transformations. Let's stop thinking about what is happening. Let's stop doing the macro level analysis, and let's get into the nitty gritty of what are the characteristics of an organization that is successful in this space, and how do you become successful? So it won't surprise you to hear me say, as a technologist, that I believe that at the foundation of successful digital transformation is this concept of flexible technology. Now, we don't have time in this presentation to really dive into that, but it's absolutely clear to me that there are organizations that have technology platforms that are flexible and allow them to move quickly when it comes to creating new experiences, new products, new capabilities. Those companies that are encumbered by legacy platforms that don't allow them to do that clearly will find it very difficult to transform digitally. And I think that I've worked for some companies, that shall remain nameless, that have had that problem, where yes, there was great vision, but the technology became an inhibitor. And so flexible technology is key. One of the ways in which some of the top companies, the top brands in the world, have been able to get flexible in this space is to embrace the power of the cloud. And in fact, On Tuesday, I was with Thomas Kieran, who's the CEO of Google Cloud, and his team was telling us about the work that they've done with companies like Twitter, like PayPal, like Target, like TikTok. And what's incredible is that all of those organizations have embraced the power of the cloud to give them more flexibility. And so I do think that is something that all of you need to consider for your organizations. But that's only the foundation. Once you have in place flexible technology, the next thing that's important is a culture of experimentation. It's this idea that you have to be comfortable to develop ideas that you put in front of your customers in a managed, controlled way in order to drive feedback and insights that will allow you to have a very impactful roadmap. And this is difficult for many organizations that are well established. This idea that you have to develop things and then test them is not an area that they are comfortable with. And I will use as an example my time at Marks and Spencer, where this idea that you could go into the boardroom and present something that perhaps hadn't been successful was really challenged by a culture where success was something that was expected at all levels. If you think about the companies that I mentioned earlier, like Apple and Google, there is a lot more comfort with this idea that you have to experiment to make the right decisions. Your insights do not come just from data alone. They have to be data informed, but you have to experiment. And that is, for me, another really important characteristic in this, as you'll see, a pyramid of characteristics. There's no point experimenting, though, if you're not actually measuring the things that matter. And one of the things that's been really powerful in my career is this idea that if you can identify the metrics that matter, if you can measure the things that actually drive your business, then you will do a much better job of actually driving those behaviors. And as we get into some of the case studies later on, I'll talk a little bit about those case studies, and we'll look at how they've been able to embrace new measurements in order to be successful. And this one is actually very difficult because some organizations are very focused on a set of metrics, either vanity metrics or traditional metrics, that don't really allow them to position themselves for digital transformation. It's great to be able to measure things, but the next thing that you need to do is you need to be able to collaborate in a different way. One of the things I love sharing with people is this fact that at Apple, there is no org chart. In fact, Apple has only ever publicly produced one org chart, and that's when the company went public. And the power of that is that the company is focused on getting the right people in the room for the project, for the decision, or for the task at hand. And that means that Steve Jobs really understood that an org chart is a historical reflection of what people did yesterday. And his belief was that I don't care what they did yesterday. What are they going to do today? And what are they going to do tomorrow? And so it was remarkable working in an organization where there is no visible org chart. I was told on my first day at Apple, whatever you do, don't create an org chart. And the reason for that is to foster, perhaps counterintuitively, to foster collaboration, seek people out based on the knowledge and the skills that they have, not on where they might sit in a hypothetical organizational structure. And that's key, and that leads to something that I describe as extreme collaboration, where the projects that I worked on at Apple would often have people from a very wide range of backgrounds from different parts of the company, because they had skills and expertise that were very relevant to the task at hand. And that is a very powerful way to organize yourselves. Next, you need agility, and there are many conferences where people talk about agility, so I won't dwell on this, but having all of these other characteristics in place is obviously good, but it's not enough to guarantee your success. You've also got to be able to move quickly. And this is another big inhibitor for many organizations, because it is hard to move quickly in an environment where there is a lot of change, and in an environment where technology skills, which are critical to digital transformation, are thin on the ground. But agility is key, and I do spend a lot of time talking with CEOs about how do they get to a place where they can be more agile. And I would say, for me, this is not about a process. It is about a culture and structural change. And so hopefully at another time, I'll get a chance to talk to you about agility. But the final characteristic is by far the most important one. And it might surprise you, because I've shared this model many times with senior leaders around the world on all the continents, and very few of them are able to guess this last single most important characteristic for when it comes to driving digital transformation. And you might kick yourself when I say that it is simply the belief that your customer is your king or queen. Those organizations that are most successful at digital transformation are those organizations that have focused on the needs of their customers, whether they be a consumer, whether they be a business, whether they be a partner. And they have worked backwards from that, and they've embraced these other characteristics, the flexible technology, the attitude for experimentation, measuring the metrics that matter, extreme collaboration and agility. But they have done so with a single North Star. It's this idea that you have to focus on what your customers need. And it is no surprise to me that the three most valuable companies in the world all have customer in their mission statement and their vision. So that's a quick canter through what I believe are the really important characteristics of organizations that are successful when it comes to digital transformation. But frameworks are fun. Theory is interesting, but let's look at some case studies, because I think this will hopefully bring it all to life for you. The first thing I'll say is that there are some surprising organizations out there that have been really successful in digital transformation. And maybe these are not the ones that you would typically go for. So some of you might be scratching your heads and say, hey, I'm listening to this guy talk, and he's saying that the UK government, PwC, and National Geographic are great examples of organizations that have embraced successfully digital transformation to leapfrog their competition and to leapfrogging in the marketplace. And that might confuse you. But I think you'll find the next case studies quite compelling because there really is a very exciting theme in all of these. So let's start by looking at the UK government. I mean, I'm British, although I live in the United States now. And one of the things I can tell you is that when I was growing up, the UK government was not known for being particularly innovative. And so it was interesting in the early 90s when I was at IBM. One of the things that I did was work quite closely with what was called the CCTA, which was the Cabinet Office Centre for Communications and Technology. And there was some great thinking that was applied there about how do you embrace the power of the information superhighway, as we called it back then, and how do you use it to change the way in which you deliver services to citizens, to businesses, to partners. And what's interesting about how the UK has approached it is that they adopted pretty early on, back in 2011, something that they talk about as their default by digital strategy. And that led to the creation of the government digital service, and this idea that everything that was being delivered by the UK government needed to be delivered digitally by default. Forward wind several years, after many great successes, the UK government has been surprisingly successful at actually delivering value through digital transformation. And as a good example, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is the organization that collects taxation in the UK, used to be, when I was growing up, the second or third biggest publisher of paper in the United Kingdom. They would send statements to people, they would produce documents, there were lots of forms. They are now able, because they have embraced this digital by default strategy, to not only deliver better services, but the government has been able to save a very, very significant amount of cost. And in fact, if you go and do some research, you'll discover that last year, the UK government was able to save $2.3 billion of cost through the digital transformation that it has embarked on over the last decade. So I think a brilliant example, a surprising example. And I can tell you, as a Brit living abroad, it is fascinating that I can do everything I need to do with the British government, whether it is renew my passport, pay my taxes, or renew my driving license. I can do that in minutes online because of this digital by default approach. So I think it's a really great example of what is possible. Next, I'm going to talk about PwC, and I have a short video here that is really giving you some insight into how PwC has been able to do things differently in order to drive its business. And once again, big audit and consulting firms may not be a place where you would typically look for innovation. But I can tell you, having worked closely with PwC when I was at Apple, their embrace of technology and of digital transformation has completely transformed their business. One of the interesting things is that if you were to go back a few years in PwC's history, the majority of the meetings that PwC partners had with customers were pre-arranged meetings that were formally structured and had a lot of to and fro between executive assistants. Through this digital transformation that PwC has put in place, the majority of its interaction with its customers are now ad hoc and initiated immediately through the Google Meet platform. So let's hear in this short video from Hilda Clune, who is the leader of this transformation at PwC.
PwC is a network of independently owned offices. We provide audit, assurance, tax and consulting services.
We're a global team. We're on video meetings all day long on Meet. We've noticed meetings tend to be 50% shorter than they were before.
Meet has improved the way we collaborate as a network. It has enough resilience, ability to scale, that gives us safety, which really responds very well to the current situation.
People can work remotely so well with Meet, which really starts to translate into massive tangible benefits. Meet allowed us to deepen our relationships with each other and make work more productive, but also far more enjoyable.
Now, I think that's a great example of an organization that has really been able to do things differently. And this new way of interacting with its customers has really transformed PwC's business, and it's now in a position to talk with other organizations, not only about the ways in which technology can help, but using itself as a case study. And I can tell you that during COVID, the platform that PwC built with Google kept the organization alive and allowed it to be incredibly successful. But the last case study I'm going to share with you is one that might resonate more with you on a personal basis. Many of you will know National Geographic, either from your childhood or from its incredible content. On this slide are two of the best known pictures, in fact, in history, in human history. On the left is a picture known as the Afghan Girl, which is widely recognized as one of the most striking and one of the most recognized pictures of all time. It was taken in Afghanistan back in the 1970s. Just a beautiful example of how National Geographic has been able to connect people to the world using the power of photography. On the right-hand side is a picture of a giant panda in China taken by Amy Vitale, one of my favorite photographers. What's interesting about this picture is that Amy dressed up as a panda for several months and went and lived in the rainforests of China in order to build a relationship with the panda such that she could get close enough. And you might say, well, why did she do that? Nobody had ever been this close to pandas in the wild before. It took her months to get there. And that has been part of National Geographic's allure for many decades. It's allowing people to understand the world around them. But here's an interesting thing. National Geographic was, in some respects, becoming a legacy organization. It had one of the most successful magazines in the world, but people were no longer buying magazines. It had one of the most successful cable channels in the world, but people, particularly in the United States, were no longer buying cable. And so that led to National Geographic realizing that it had to make a real change. And what's interesting is the success of the change that National Geographic has been through. The seeds of that success were actually planted back in its origins. So if we were to go back to the early 1900s, in fact, if you were to pick up a National Geographic magazine in 1906, you may have seen these images. These images of what looked like very startled deer were the first ever published images that used flash photography. In fact, it was so profound at the time that several members of the National Geographic board actually resigned in disgust. They were concerned about the impact of this new technology on the animals. They were concerned that it wasn't scientific and this wasn't the right way to share photography. But National Geographic has, from its inception, had a culture of innovation, and the people who wanted to embrace this innovation prevailed. And of course, we know that over the next century, National Geographic did an incredible job of not only delivering great photography, but continuing to innovate in photography. But by the time we got to 2016, the company realized it needed to innovate further. And it did something quite remarkable. It embraced the power of social media to transform its relationship with its consumers. So in this short video, we'll see an example of what that looks like in practice.
Hello, my name is Charlie Hamilton Jones, and today I'm on assignment for National Geographic.
So that fascinating video of one of the National Geographic explorers in an elephant sanctuary is one that brings a smile to my face, because in this particular instance, Charlie decided to live stream what he was doing via Instagram. And this has really changed the way in which National Geographic has interacted with the world, in that today, National Geographic has gone from a legacy magazine and a legacy TV channel to the world's #1 social media brand. In fact, these sorts of broadcasts, like the one in that video, are watched by millions of people around the world. And on these final few slides, I'll give you an insight into just how profound that can be. The first thing to say is that National Geographic's website, which my team and I at National Geographic spent a lot of time designing and building, it supports a pretty significant membership base. And there are around 27 million people that will interact with that website on a monthly basis, which is it's a rich source of information for teachers, for parents, for children, for people interested in the world around them. But where it starts to get very interesting is when you look at the number of people then who interact with National Geographic through those new social channels that I talked about. Believe it or not, every single day, 440 million people interact with National Geographic through Instagram, through Facebook, through Snap. And that makes it by far the most successful brand ever when it comes to social media. In fact, the only thing that has more followers in social media than National Geographic is Kim Kardashian. And that could lead to a whole other discussion about the nature of society. But 440 million people a day interacting with National Geographic, consuming its content. And then to add another interesting statistic to this list, every month, 7.6 billion content impressions are delivered by National Geographic digitally. That is, if you think about it, a piece of content for every human being alive on our planet today. So it's a remarkable success story. A 133-year-old organization has been able to transform itself by embracing digital transformation. It has been able to leapfrog its competition and leapfrog the industry by really harnessing the power of digital transformation. And I hope that's an inspiration for all of you, because I think there are many things that we can learn from those organizations. And I'm excited to have the opportunity now to get into a little bit of a Q&A about some of these topics. Thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marcus, for that fascinating talk. Let me ask you a few questions before we wrap up. Marcus, I was really intrigued by some of the characteristics you were talking about 5 or 10 minutes ago about the culture of experimentation, which absolutely makes sense, of course. But that transformation in itself must be very difficult, I would assume, because experimentation means sometimes you lose, sometimes you're wrong, sometimes
Yes.
the ideas you try and the products you try don't work out. How do people get past that or learn that culture of experimentation for themselves?
Yeah, it is very hard, John. I will tell you that during my time in the boardroom at Marks and Spencer, one of the things I observed was that everything that people presented to the senior leadership had to be framed as a success. And what that meant was that rather than really getting into the detail of what have we learned and what are the ways in which we can do things, people through the culture had sort of been taught to massage things to the extent that it was always a success and you sort of hide your failures. And there is a difficulty with that, in that companies that have a healthier attitude towards experimentation, they realize that you actually get as much value from the things that didn't go well as you do from the things that did go well. And I believe that to drive that change, you really have to start at the top. Does the CEO allow people to come and share insights that may not always be positive? Does going into the boardroom and presenting a project or product that failed, does that lead to the termination of your career? And we know that in many companies, there is this idea that you always have to be successful. But I think that the companies that have been able to embrace digital transformation and leapfrog have seen that top-down change, which has allowed people to be comfortable to go and share their insights and their knowledge in a way that didn't happen before. So I think that this, for me, is one of the critical requirements on leadership. This is driven by the CEO and by the senior leadership team in any organization. And, I'm very fortunate to work for an organization where experimentation is actually part of the culture. T-Mobile is known as the Un-carrier because it is always ready to do things different and to take risks. And that is something that has empowered and enabled the organization in a way that many other companies have been unable to do.
Right, fantastic. Marcus, can I link this to those metrics that matter that you spoke about? Can you give us, in summary, a couple of examples? Is it about consumer focus? You're talking about Nat Geo. It's not about time in the office anymore now that we have hybrid working and everything. But can you give us a couple of examples that metrics that matter that really take your eye, that really make you think?
Yeah, so one that, for those of you who are more technically inclined, will be interesting is that when I was at Apple, there was a very clear connection between the work that a software engineer was doing on their keyboard and how it impacted the business. And so there was almost an obsession about making sure that they were accurately tracking how much effort was being put into developing something. And then once it was launched, how successful it was versus the business case that had been originally put together. And that I have seen as being almost uniquely disciplined in that many organizations, there's a business case that gets built before we launch a project. We then launch the project. We launch the project, we're off to the next thing. But this idea that you're actually measuring the inputs and the outputs in a very detailed, very granular way is core to Apple's culture, and I think super powerful. But the most interesting example is one that was introduced at National Geographic. And this was a little bit painful to watch, but also beautiful to see the results of. National Geographic had a very strong culture of creating very powerful, emotive, very well-researched editorial. And so it was not unusual for a piece of editorial work to take 18 months. People would travel the world and they would research. And during this digital transformation, my boss, Rachel Weber, she introduced a new approach. We were going to actually assess the success of the editorial staff, the journalists and the writers, not based on how many Pulitzers they had won, which seemed to have been one of the previous measures. They were going to be measured by the level of engagement that there was with the material that they produced and the advertising revenue that was connected with that. Now, as you can imagine, at first, there was a lot of resistance to this. And I remember the day when a massive dashboard went up in the press area, and there were people in the newsroom who were now seeing, as they were producing an article, it would go live on nationalgeographic.com, and then they would see how many consumers were interacting with it and how much advertising revenue was being generated. Guess what? It changed the way in which they produce content. And as difficult as it was for some of the newsroom, for those people that embraced it, it completely changed the way in which they wrote. And this idea that I'm now writing an article to drive engagement and to drive advertising revenue is what's allowed National Geographic to create that incredible success that I talked about during the case study. So for me, that's just a beautiful example of when you do focus on the metrics that matter, you can completely change your organization. And that's why I think it's such an important component in that set of characteristics.
Wonderful. One last question, Marcus. One last question. I wanted to ask you about the no-wall chart, which I can see would create collaboration, super collaboration. But how does it interact with decision-making and responsibilities? Do those things need to still be clear? I mean, how does that interaction work with people having to make decisions after all that collaboration?
Yeah, another great question, John. One of the things that I really loved about that no-wall chart approach was that because you're pulling together people who have the right skills, you then can focus on, okay, what are the metrics that we're going to get after? So I'll share with you two interesting examples of what this looks like in reality. One of the things that would happen quite a lot for me when I was at Apple is that I would be, pulled into a project team or a program team. There'd be a lot of secrecy around some of the things that were being done. So you sometimes wouldn't understand, well, what does that person do? What am I doing? And so the language that people use in order to interact is, what is your primary KPI? What is the thing that you're trying to achieve? And so I remember vividly on my last big program at Apple, which was the iPhone upgrade program. After the initial kickoff, people would then say, well, what's your primary measurement? And somebody would say, well, I'm measured on net promoter score. And then somebody else would say, well, I'm measured on defect rate. And you get to this beautiful place where suddenly the vocabulary and the discussion is all about the metrics of success. And I would say that's worked out pretty well for Apple. So whilst it's a radical approach, I think that it probably does highlight that there's some value there. And another quick example of that would be this idea that because there's no org chart, you can find yourselves with some very pretty interesting situations. So a quick anecdote in the last few seconds. During my second week at Apple, I was invited to join a conference call. I listened to this call, and it was about a secret project that was being done. And everybody on the call introduced themselves not by their name, but they talked about the action that they were driving. And at the end of this call, I put the phone down, and two of my team came into my office, and they said, "Hey, Marcus, we heard your voice on this conference call. We're working on this secret project as well." And we sat down around my conference table and started talking. Their manager came in, because they didn't report directly to me. They reported to somebody who reported to me. Their manager came in and said, "Hey, guys, I've just seen you come into Marcus's office. Is everything okay?" And the most junior person turned around and put their hand up and said, "Hey, you're not allowed to be in here. This is a restricted project." And their manager said, "Oh, I'm really sorry," and then backed out of the meeting. And so that is how profound this idea of no org chart is. Those two people in my office who were relatively junior, they had skills and capabilities that were critical to the project. And so rather than encumber them by having to inform their manager about what they were doing, they are literally pulled into the project. They're empowered to be the decision maker. And their manager in this case didn't even know what the project was. And that's just a remarkable way to work. And once again, we know that Apple has been pretty successful. So there must be something in it, John.
Absolutely. Marcus, thank you so much. Listen, you mentioned you could talk for hours, and I think we could talk for hours. So thank you so much. Sharing your insight, your experiences have been absolutely fantastic. But we've run out of time. I just want to thank you again, Marcus, and take care.